Good evening. The League of Women Voters of Pocatello welcomes you to our 2022 Idaho Legislature Preview. I am Terry Kaufman, the moderator of tonight's forum. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization which seeks to promote active participation of citizens in government. Recordings of this event may not be used without the express written approval of the League. No part of a League-sponsored video production may be used in advertising or in any way to promote a candidate. The League will only allow audio-video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety. The format for tonight will be as follows. I will call on each panelist, and they will each have 4 minutes for their introduction, and then they'll have 2 minutes to answer each question. Questions were compiled and sent to them by the Pocatello League. We will not be taking questions from the audience this evening, and viewers will be muted. Panelists, please mute yourself when you are not answering. Also, viewers, please mute and turn off your video camera. You can view the speaker by clicking on the speaker view option in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Tonight, we will hear from Senator Mark Nye, Representative Kevin Andrus, and Representative Dustin Manwaring. I will introduce our panelists now. Senator Mark Nye represents District 29. He is in his 3rd term. He previously served 1 term in the House from 2014 to 2016. He serves on the following committees: Finance and Local Government and Taxation. Representative Kevin Andrus represents District 28, Seat B. He is in his 2nd term. He serves on the following committees: Agricultural Affairs, Business, and State Affairs. And Representative Dustin Manwaring represents District 29, Seat A. He is in his 2nd term. He previously served 1 term in the House from 2016 to 2018. He serves on the following committees: Resources and Conservation, Revenue and Taxation, and Transportation and Defense. So now, starting with Senator Nye, you will each have up to 4 minutes to share your views on the issues and bills that you expect to be introduced during the upcoming legislative session. What do you see as the greatest opportunity in the upcoming legislative session? What do you see as the greatest problem? What are your goals for this session? We'll start with Senator Nye, and then Representative Andrus, and then Representative Manwaring.
Well, thanks, Terry, and thanks to the League for doing this. Eva's still a member, I think, so she's given me some pointers. As you know, I grew up in Pocatello and practiced law here for a long time. So it helps to be able to read the law and help. This will be my 8th winter in Boise, believe it or not, doing this. And it's a real privilege to do it. And I'm sure for the other guys here tonight. I think the opportunities here, most people are going to talk about the extra funds we have. Some will call it a surplus. I call it, we've been waiting too long to spend what we have. But it's going to be a challenge on how to allocate the money. I think the issues, Terry, are, as usual, education and jobs, and respect for teachers, and try to get good jobs. So there are other issues that I'm sure we're going to talk about and should. Like, to me, one of the main things we need to deal with is property tax relief, as well as grocery tax. I think it's time to end it, even though there's mixed benefit. So we can go through these as we go, but thanks again, and happy anniversary to the League, I guess, next year. So thank you.
Representative Andrus?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to the League for letting us be here and to talk to constituents. I really appreciate that. When it comes to the greatest opportunity that I see in the upcoming session, I think it's got to be the surplus. That's a big deal. There's so much opportunity there. And then also with that is one of the greatest problems is making sure that we spend it wisely and that we take good care of the monies of all the citizens of Idaho. We need to make sure that we spend it correctly. And then I think there's a special need to save some for the future with the uncertainty that the economy can bring. So that. And then another big issue that I see is that of property taxes. It's a continual problem that I see as far as rising property taxes and people getting forced out of their homes that they own because they're on a set budget and they can't meet the rising property taxes. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Manwaring.
Well, good evening to the league, and thanks for having us tonight. And I also see several familiar names of those attending, so it's good to see some familiar names from back home. For this session, I think my expectations are first and foremost to get back to civility. We sort of lost that last session, and I think we took a downward turn from what we saw. And I think some of that was just driven by the pandemic, and tensions were very high. So I'm hoping, and we're off to a good start so far, we're only in day 2, but that we can have civility return to the legislature and that we can end timely. We didn't do that either last year. So 2 things right off the bat that I hope we do. But as far as policy is concerned, we are in this unique position where we have a record surplus, and we'll refer to that more, I'm sure, throughout the evening. But that number is $1.9 billion. And so we're in a unique position, a historic position in Idaho on what we do with that money. And so a lot of our discussion and everything we do this session will be how to spend and how to save and use that money. One thing that has been mentioned already, I think by both the other representatives here, is property tax relief. I think that one is going to rise to the top of issues that needs to be addressed and should be addressed. One issue that I'm looking for, ways that the state can continue to address our skills gap in labor and our labor shortage in the market. So I think that's one thing we consistently see is for about every 3 jobs in Idaho, we have about one person available for those jobs. And so that's what I'm looking for, ways that we can address tax relief, address property taxes in particular, and address the labor shortage in our state. With that being said, I just mentioned briefly my other goals, include I'll be sort of deep in the weeds on tax policy this year, and I enjoy doing that, but I'm also working on some digital asset legislation. So that's what I'm focused on, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the questions. You will each have 2 minutes to answer each question. So we'll start with Representative Andrus and then rotate through the panelists in alphabetical order. First question is regarding education funding. With the budget surplus nearing $1.6 billion, the governor is relief for Idahoans and businesses while investing in education. How will it work to support schools and teacher salaries, which have been chronically underfunded? Will the legislature address school district supplemental levies and full-time kindergarten? How will you ensure higher education funding is not influenced by divisive ideologies? Oh, sorry, we'll start with Representative Andrus.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there, and I mean, education is very important to our community and to the state, and thankfully it's also important to the governor. So it's a priority of his, as he mentioned in the State of the State. In 2 minutes, I don't know how much of all of those I can go into, but I'll just say that I don't have the privilege of being on the Joint Finance Appropriation Committee nor on the Education Committee. So I don't see a lot of these issues with funding nor policy on education until they come to the full floor. So I'm in some conversations on what things are coming, but I don't have a large say in those items. But I think full-time kindergarten is coming. I'm back and forth on it. I recognize the importance to get a good start with children, but I also deeply value the importance of keeping children in the home with their parents at a young age. I strongly support higher education. ISU is vital to our community, and I guess I'm about out of time. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Manwaring?
Yeah, so I mean, I've supported education and the teacher career ladder increases in the past, and if you add that up over the last several years, it's approaching $1 billion, and the governor's committed to another $1 billion in the next 5 years going into education, including this year completely funding out that career ladder, the teacher increases. That's an 11% increase. We're also seeing that potential legislation this year to help decrease the insurance costs for educators. That will be a direct savings in their pocket, and to help their families when they don't have that significant burden as of significant burden for their health premiums. One thing that I did see, and I need to learn more about it myself, but several decades ago, one thing the legislature did do was take on some of the burden from the supplemental levies that had been passed by the voters around the state and those local taxing districts. And so, we can look at, we're going to be talking about ways to reduce property taxes, but of course the supplemental levies is a direct burden to the taxpayers around Idaho. And so anything we can do with regard to those levies would be helpful. I do believe that full-time kindergarten is coming. And I support it as long as there's measurable results and that there's flexibility with the local school districts on how they spend those dollars. And then lastly, what can I do around the university's budgets and what's happened with the culture in universities? I think I just need to speak up more and express how I feel about what I know is going on at the universities.
Thank you. Senator Nye? You're muted. We're not hearing you.
How's that?
That's better. Thanks.
On CRT's critical race, I was trying to say it's a bogus issue, at least in Idaho. And it's, I don't know how we ignore it, but something we got to deal with. In other words, we talked to university presidents and school teachers. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to some of my predecessors that are here tonight, Lane Smith and Donna Bowe. Hi. But yes, kindergarten's not just coming, it should be here and it will be here. Higher ed should get more than it's getting, but the real problem is that K through 12 is constitutionally mandated, but the amount we spend per student in Idaho is one of the lowest in the U.S. That's got to change. So there are various issues, but I think with the funds we have, we can prudently try to catch up to where we should be. Thanks.
Next question is on climate. The U.S. League of Women Voters position on climate change calls for prompt action to cut this country's greenhouse gas emissions and invest in a clean energy economy. The current administration recognizes the effects of climate change and is providing federal funds for projects. How should the legislature address the effects of climate change on Idaho's businesses and economy during this session? Start with Mr. Manwaring.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question because this responsibility falls on private business, on state government and federal government. Really, the responsibility is on all of us. But I think there are some things we can do. I mean, we need to make sure we're investing in good forest practices and management and taking climate issues seriously, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of climate change, addressing that there are changes in our environment and we need to take those seriously. And part of that is good forest management and practices and addressing and eliminating some of the wildfires that we have and the expenses that goes into that. I think one of the programs that I've seen proposed is, we're having different changes in drought weather around our state, and so we're going to have potential potential water issues, so investing in those issues, but also being innovative with some programs like cloud seeding potentially will be policy decisions we're going to be making in Idaho.
Thank you. Mr. Nye? Unmute.
Okay.
Okay.
I think water is going to be a big recipient of funds this year to recharge and help the drought that we had and the climate. I think the state could step up and help on electric vehicles to set up stations where cars could recharge their batteries. Also, I think we have to look forward like Idaho Power has done. They've announced they're going to try to be carbon free within 10 years or so. So I think it's not just an issue that we talk about. I think we're going to do something about it. Thanks.
Mr. Andrus?
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas that the senator and representative brought up. I think along with what Representative Manwaring said, that I think I would agree, as I understood it, that a lot of the issues should be more dealt with on a business level rather than mandates from the government. But I do think there is something that can be done as far as public ground. If we can do some wildlife or wildfire mitigation projects like grazing, shout out to all the livestock producers out there. Anyway, and then and controlled logging, I think will be very beneficial. And then there's things that we can do with the, you've got a point on salmon and steelhead populations to plant more of those species through hatcheries and get those populations up. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is about election integrity. States have the constitutional responsibility of overseeing elections. Idahoans enjoy having few voting restrictions, such as same-day registration, no excuse absentee ballots, and early voting. Last session, there were bills to change these procedures. Are you concerned about voter fraud and voter suppression in Idaho? What will you do to ensure voting rights are protected? We'll start with Mr. Nye.
We have no significant problems at all on voting rights in Idaho. In fact, the governor spoke about that yesterday in the State of the State. There's very little, if any, fraud or abuse in that area for our state, thank goodness. We are going to allocate funds for cybersecurity that will help even further. So that's more of a national issue, or at least an issue that's been promoted nationally. But in Idaho, fortunately, it's not a problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Andrus?
Yeah, I would agree that there's little to no concern of fraudulent elections in Idaho. But I serve on the State Affairs Committee where we deal with elections, and there were concerns brought by constituents that were some of those bills that were worked on. I can think of one dealing in Lewiston, but so I won't be bringing anything, but I'm open to any concerns about election integrity because that is a very fundamental right. And if people can't trust their elections, then we need to do something about it.
Thank you. Mr. Manwaring?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sentiment's been shared about in Idaho, we have fair and secure elections, and I do truly believe that. What I will say though is I am concerned about sort of what I call this trickle down political sentiment that came out of the last presidential cycle. And I think that's where some of that percolates with voters in our state. And we have to take that serious and make sure that we're doing things to make sure we're reinforcing that we do have secure elections in Idaho. And so on that note, I think one thing the Secretary of State's office did this past year was was starting to do their post-election auditing. And I think we're going to see legislation to boost that up and make sure it's permanent. And I expect that'll be about 5% of the vote in each election to do a post-election audit. And I think that will go to shoring up and providing that assurance to the public. And Senator Nye mentioned cybersecurity and voting technology, and there will be legislation I expect to see from the governor in the cybersecurity fund to help bolster that security. So that's what I think we can do, and what I see with election security.
Thank you. Next question is about property taxes. Property taxes are increasing. The Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy reports that families who earn less pay a greater percentage of their income to property taxes. School district levies add to this burden, and companies are discouraged from moving to Idaho. What legislative options may be presented to ensure property taxes are more sustainable and equitable across all income levels? And we'll start with Mr. Andrus.
Thank you. As I mentioned, this is one of my greatest concerns in our state and especially in our community. To the first question about would there be fewer supplemental levies if the education budget increased? That is a good question. And I think if there was a guarantee that that would happen, I think the state would be more inclined to increase education funding. There's the concern that if we increase it and those levies do not dissipate, that we're just adding more to the tax burden. But it is an option. And then to the point about if what other options there are, I've talked about putting a freeze on property taxes, but the difficulty is anytime you freeze something for someone, it's all part of the puzzle that it increase for somebody else. So I will continue to look for solutions. At this point, I don't know what the best solution is. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Manwaring?
Well, I mean, to directly answer the question, I would hope so. I would hope that if there would be fewer supplemental levies if education funding is increasing. That seems to be logical. And I mentioned, maybe a possible solution in the past where the state did take on some of that direct supplemental burden, and that's direct property tax reduction. A couple of things that we could do potentially. I mean, obviously, we could go back to indexing the homeowner's exemption. Right now, that's set at $125,000. One proposal I saw kicked around a little bit last year. I don't know if it'll surface again, but that was increasing the maximum value of your home that can be exempted up to that $125,000 level, which currently is at 50%. So potentially could be increased to 55% or some greater value of your home for exemption purposes. But again, when you do exemptions for one category, like homeowners, like Representative Andrus mentioned, it shifts the burden over to ag or commercial. And so that's the balancing act. And it's going to be a continued adjustment year to year to try to make that equitable.
Thank you. Mr. Nye?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question, Terry. I think property tax is probably the priority issue this time in the session. I think we should take a multi-phase approach. Number one, increase the exemption. Number two, we don't tell the people enough that they don't have to pay it. In other words, there is a program where if you're eligible, you can defer payment indefinitely, and at 2%. I think it's 2% is what you have to pay, or the property is assessed that much eventually. But you can actually defer it, and hopefully the commissioners and the assessor will get the word out on that. I think the state should pick up the funding more for schools. It should be the state's responsibility, not the locals. And if we were to allocate enough per pupil, on a formula to take care of the levies, it would be the way to go. Right now, the levies amount to about $200 million if you add them all up together. So if you spread that same amount across all districts, not that amount, but the appropriate amount, it would have the state meet its obligation rather than put it on the locals. And that's a direct benefit to the property tax. So I think we're going to get there this time. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, COVID vaccine mandates. The Idaho Special Legislative Session passed a joint memorial opposing President Biden's vaccine mandate. Bills focusing on COVID vaccinations were held in a Senate committee. Was this a good investment of taxpayer funds? Will similar bills be introduced in this session? What is government's role in supporting healthy communities and healthcare services? Discuss your views on the rights of businesses, individuals, and the community. And we'll start with Mr. Manwaring.
Was it a good investment? I mean, in hindsight, no, but I didn't think we should have been addressing those issues as far as trying to spend time trying to pass legislation that wasn't going to be effective. And so I was sort of in the camp that was expecting that result, and wasn't surprised when we didn't get out of here without passing anything but a resolution. Are we expected to see similar bills arise? I still expect to see some of those in some form arise. We haven't yet, but I expect to see some of them come back in some form. As a state, what's government's role? I think that was what was asked. And I think we have an obligation as a state to care for our indigent. We have a great health and welfare system, but that's our obligation, is to take care of our indigent population, provide adequate health care for those individuals. And the last part of the question was about my view on, individual business rights and individuals in the community with regard to these issues. And I think for the most part, I'm a supporter of individual rights and private business rights, including the rights, whether that's to wear masks or mandate masks within your business or not, or require your employers to have vaccines or not. I believe that's a private employer's right. Those are different to me than government mandates for those things. So I'm a general supporter of individual health freedom and choice, and that I believe health decisions should be left to communities and local officials and leaders as much as possible, and not mandated by the state or federal government.
Thank you. Mr. Nye?
I have similar views. I don't think the government should mandate or the people should mandate, say, what a business does or doesn't do. The federal government has federal employees, and they have the right to try to take care of things by mandate. The real problem for us in Idaho is that we are failing. We're probably the least vaccinated state in the whole country. And we hear a lot about everybody talking about their freedom, but there should be a freedom from disease as well. So whatever we're doing, we're not doing well. It's not just a matter of mandate or not. It's a matter of education and trying to get the word out. So I appreciate people's input on how to make us safer and get the word out better. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Andrus?
Thank you. I was probably, of the three of us, I was the most encouraged about going to the special session to stop the mandates. But also I would say in retrospect that it was very unsuccessful and not a good use of taxpayer funds. I was very disappointed in the outcome. And then I haven't heard of any other similar bills that are going to be introduced in this session, but it would not surprise me that there will be some. In fact, I would be surprised more if there were not any other bills of a similar vein. And then with my general views on business and individual rights, I think for the most part, an individual's rights are the most protected in the Constitution. Businesses have rights to ask their employees to do certain things when they're at work. But when it comes to the vaccine, and that will affect them both at work and then at home, I think individuals should have more say in that than business. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. In regards to federal monies, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 provided stimulus funds for state governments. Yet the legislature rejected a $6 million grant for early childhood education and cut $2.5 million for higher education. More federal monies will become available through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. What determines the decision to accept or reject these funds? How does the legislature plan to use these funds? And what are your priorities on the use of this money to improve the lives of all Idahoans? And we'll start with Mr. Nye.
Thank you. That $6 million for early childhood should have been accepted. I voted for it, and I'll vote for it again. I think we should get it. I think it's really something we really have to have and been fighting for like 40, 50 years. On the $2.5 million penalty for higher ed, I voted against that, of course. And that was just an out-of-state influence, worrying our people and our citizens about CRT, critical race theory. On the federal monies, we should look at them as one-time assistance, and focus our efforts on where to use them for the best, like infrastructure and other things that we can use now, rather than obligating ourselves long-term on that federal assistance. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Andrus?
Thank you. When it comes to federal funding, I think I agree greatly with Senator Nye that we should look at it as one-time monies. I think my concern when it comes to federal money, receiving that and accepting it, is when we receive the same money for the same jobs every year and it gets to where we depend on it, because I don't know that we'll always be able to depend on it. And if we get so dependent on it, then there may come a time where we don't have it and we're lost and we don't know what to do without it. So as long as we can receive those funds, but we also have ability to do other things, if we don't get them, then I think we should continue to receive them. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Manwaring?
Yeah, so the decision making with whether we're going to spend those funds or reject those funds, obviously it's the consensus of the body and the governor. If in most instances, if those funds aren't appropriated, then eventually they would revert back to the federal government and be reallocated to another state. So it's really just consensus driven, but we are bound by those parameters of the federal guidelines. And generally speaking, we're in lanes of spending regarding water infrastructure projects, sewer infrastructure projects, and broadband in particular. So you'll see significant investments in those three areas, but also hopefully paying for some of the deferred maintenance that we have around the state, and spending on capital projects and debt that are things that will pay dividends in the future. So I expect that would be, the good use of those funds and not creating ongoing liabilities for the state.
Thank you. Next question is about legal defense funding. During the 2021 session, the legislature increased the legal defense fund by $4 million. Why does the legislature use costly private legal services rather than the services of the Idaho Attorney General's office? Is this the best use of taxpayer money? And I think we'll start with Mr. Andrus.
Thank you. I was on the wrong question. So this is a complicated one, and I don't know. I don't follow the legal defense fund very closely. I think the, dare I say, contention between the different bodies of the of government at the state level, I think are certainly causing money to be spent where it shouldn't be, and that we should be using our different agencies better. But I don't know what the best solution is. There is concern that that we want to get the best legal advice as possible, and I don't know many of the intricacies with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Manwaring?
So historically, there's been sort of this conflict, either real or perceived conflict, and some of it's just the natural dynamic that happens between the bodies of government, the legislative and executive branch in particular. And we have an attorney general's office that has to represent both of those bodies. And so sometimes that I've seen perceived conflict or a lack of what the legislature feels like is a defense of its policies and laws that have been passed. And I think that's the outs, that's where that's come from. And so, but when I look at the facts, when I look at how much out of that fund has been spent historically, the state just continues to lose cases. We should be learning our lessons and acting accordingly and not passing bad legislation in the first place. So from that perspective, it's not a good use of funds. I also think, sometimes private counsel is hired on the front end to either draft legislation or in special circumstances like ethics proceedings. And those can be good uses of outside counsel aside from the Attorney General's office. And then sometimes there might be other conflicts. I mean, for example, right now, the Attorney General's office represents the land board and the Attorney General's on the land board. People have raised that as a potential conflict and a reason to use outside counsel, but to date that hasn't changed. And so, there are some real issues there, but a good use of funds so far. Track record doesn't show.
Thank you. Mr. Nye?
Thank you. I think Representative Manwaring has got some good points. And I agree with most everything he said. I've seen a case where the Attorney General gave an opinion on a piece of pending legislation, gave an opinion to the legislature saying it was invalid, it wouldn't pass. I think it was on abortion, that it wasn't constitutional. So the legislature went in and passed it. There was a lawsuit. The state lost the lawsuit, just like the Attorney General said. And guess what? One of the pieces of evidence in the case was by the way, the Attorney General was defending the case. And one of the pieces of evidence was his letter of opinion saying it was bad law. The state had to pay for that. The real problem here is there's too much discretion on the use of the monies by the House and the Senate on defending cases that should have been brought. So I agree that to the extent possible, the Attorney General should be the attorney of choice. That's his job, and that's who we voted for. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question's on redistricting. The Idaho Redistricting Commission submitted new district maps based on the 2020 census. There have been several legal challenges to these maps. How do you feel about the proposed legislative district and the congressional district maps? And we'll start with Mr. Manwaring.
I think it was the L3 map. I mean, in any event, the map at this point has been adopted and is before the Supreme Court with at least four challenges that are consolidated. I think they're going to hear those the end of this week. We'll wait and see what the result is and if that map holds up. One thing that I do know is this commission did accomplish getting those districts to be very equal, and going back to the constitutional requirement of one person, one vote. Those districts are equal, and so there's other factors to consider, but they did accomplish that, and that's arguably the most important thing they were required to do. With regard to, what southeastern Idaho looks like in particular, obviously District 29 added some folks, and all of our districts over there for the most part grew in size. So we'll all live with that map and take it as we get it, and we'll see what the Supreme Court does here soon.
Thank you. Mr. Nye?
I was very impressed with the process this time. Maybe your other league members, I'm sure they know, but others may not, on the method in choosing the people on the commission. There's 6 that are chosen, 3 of each party. And they went around the state, took hearings, and it's partly a math problem trying to get things equalized. So I think the map drawn by the commission will be the one that's adopted by the Supreme Court. I've looked at the other cases. I could be wrong, but I think that's what'll happen. I did worry, and I still worry, whether or not the ISU students were properly counted. And sometime this month, there'll be a final revision of the census numbers. They call it truing up the numbers. It will not affect the reapportionment process, but there may have been several thousand kids that were not included that should have been. But overall, I think it's a good map, and I think we're going the right way. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Andrus?
Yeah, I personally, with this map, it hurts me quite a bit. Just a few thousand of my current constituents go with me to a different district where it's completely foreign, and then we have to travel from the Utah border clear up to Teton County and Bonneville County. So that is challenging. I don't know. It's easy for me to say that it could have been better, but I don't know that it could have been better. Obviously, the committee approved it with a unanimous vote. So we'll see what happens. I have no idea. I've heard both things, that it'll get overturned and then it won't. So we'll see how it goes and just live with it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Sorry, I am moving around a little bit in the order here, but I think I will ask one more question about the lobbyists. Hundreds of lobbyists impacted legislation in Idaho during the 2021 legislative session. They represented agriculture, business, local governments, healthcare, and political interest groups. How are you influenced by lobbyists? Where do you go for reliable information? What influences how you will vote on a particular bill? And emails, letters, and phone calls from constituents make a difference. And we'll start with Mr. Andrus.
Thank you. This is a great question. For me, when it comes to how I'm influenced by lobbyists, and then also with the question on where do I go for reliable information, I use lobbyists a lot for that information, and so therefore I am influenced by them. I find them to be generally well informed and honest, and I can say straight to them what's the opposition on this, and they'll tell me, and I can get a good take on both sides. And I will be frank that as I become closer to lobbyists, it is harder to say no to things that they want me to do, but I always remember that I represent my constituents and not the lobbyists, and every lobbyist here that I've said no to for that I will not be supporting something, they've always been very respectful of that decision, recognizing that I'm not representing them. And then the question on, do emails, letters, and phone calls make a difference from constituents? They most certainly do. On some bills, I feel like I have a good understanding of what the majority of the constituents want on a bill, and that makes it easier, but on others, I don't. So those calls and that correspondence is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Manwaring?
Idaho lobbyists, and I guess lobbyists in general, I mean, the currency that they deal with is trust. They don't pay us for votes, so we know the ones that we can trust, or that we feel like we can trust, or that we've lost some of that trust within the past. But for the most part, they're pretty careful about that in Idaho, and they do a good job with it. But I think the first step in not being overly influenced by lobbyists is to just recognize that they do have special interests, and recognize that that's what it is. But they do have good information, and they are good sources of information for lots of things on all sides of issues when you're trying to get more information, and they're quite helpful in a lot of cases. What do I rely on in addition? Obviously, I rely on doing my own research almost always. And even if that's asking a colleague or someone that I trust elsewhere, or calling a local official and asking for information, or calling up an agency staff member and getting information directly from the agency. I measure my decision-making usually by three things. I ask myself, is it good for individuals and families? Is it good for Idaho businesses? And then the last measure is does government need to do anything in this case, or can we solve this issue without government? And those are usually the three questions I ask myself on anything. And I absolutely read and respond as best I can to local constituent contacts and emails. That is important for me, particularly when we see it come from Bannock County or from Pocatello.
Thank you. Mr. Nye? Oh, you're muted still.
I don't know why that keeps kicking in. I've never called a lobbyist for information. I think the most important place to get the information is from constituents who write and call, and some even come in. For example, there was a man from Pocatello that stepped down and spoke to me right after the State of the State. That's who I listen to. The lobbyists are a good source of information, but most of them are lawyers. I knew them before, and before they're even lobbyists, so I can talk to them and try to cross-examine them a little bit about where they're coming from. So the good thing in Idaho is almost everybody knows everybody, or knows somebody that knows them. So the good thing about lobbyists in Idaho is basically they're advocates for a position, and we sort of know where they're coming from and why. So to me, the best source of information is things we bring to the table and what we hear from our constituents. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have time for tonight. I want to thank our legislators and our audience for attending this evening. This forum was recorded and will be available for viewing in the next few days on the League of Women Voters Pocatello website and on YouTube. We want to remind you that your voice matters. Be sure to contact our legislators with your comments and questions. Thank you again to everyone for participating, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.